An alliterative summary of Samuel today, and that is a very ambitious word to open a video with. This, of course, being the first book of Samuel we're summarising. I thoroughly enjoyed that one. It was very good, very interesting. Completely nuts, obviously, as they're all a bit nuts in their own way, aren't they? But it does, again, sort of stick a finger in the eye of that idea that the reputation of the Old Testament is that it's kind of dark and it's kind of boring. It's definitely dark. A lot of it's dark anyway, and like Leviticus is one of the most boring things ever written. But on the whole, otherwise, I've been finding it's a good, fun story. Well, fun is a difficult word to use for it, isn't it? But it's a good story and interesting, certainly. Overall, this is obviously an account of Israel's first king and the rise of David, but it is very difficult to get to grips with, and there are some very conflicting ideas within it. Most notably with regard to Israel having a king. Essentially, it seems to be a story about the Israelites wanting a king, God saying, no, this is a terrible idea, don't do that. The Israelites then insist. They then get a hopeless king who's completely barking mad, which may or may not be God's fault. We'll come back to that. And in the background, all throughout this, David's stock is rising such that with the first king, Saul, now dead, presumably we're going to pick this up in Samuel, second book of Samuel, with David taking over as the king. In terms of dates, we're now at around 1000 BC, but interestingly, we're getting into a zone where it seems that there is some historical agreement with some of this stuff. There's nothing conclusive or to suggest that Moses existed, but apparently everyone pretty much accepts that David was a real guy. So, detail aside, it does seem that the broad shape of this is going to be largely historical, I think. The story continues the theme of God favouring an underdog, but you do have to ask, what the hell was he thinking with Saul? Saul seemed to be chosen based on almost on his stature as it was described, but then shortly after in the same story it says that God likes to look at the heart and only people look at the exterior. So this sort of conflicts with the idea that Saul seemed to be chosen for his physical prowess. Because Saul can't have been chosen based on good things in his heart, because he was a terrible person, he had horrible aim with a spear, and he was highly unobservant when it came to going to the toilet in caves. So unless the Spirit of God came upon Saul to make him evil, which has some problems anyway, which we'll come back to, then the choice of Saul makes no real sense. As mentioned there, that raises the issue of if God puts this evil spirit on someone to make him a terrible person, then that's an even worse situation than just Saul being a punk and God having misjudged him, surely. It seems, therefore, that either the writer of the book has misinterpreted Saul being a punk as God doing that to him, or I'm just missing lots of things. And given I'm struggling to come up with a conclusion for the book of 1 Samuel, that may well be the case. One of my favourite bits in this was this idea that it's better to obey than to sacrifice. And I suppose perhaps that should have been obvious, but it does sort of suggest that there's an idea that if you just do as you're told, there is no need for atonement. Albeit that's a tricky concept in the sense that we're yet to meet even one of the heroes who is actually sinless. So perhaps it just alludes to the fact that it's impossible for anyone to be sinless. So therefore everyone needs to atone. But if you've got anything God has asked you to do, you have to do it. It's very important that you do. Also very interesting that we've encountered our first reference to the afterlife, albeit it's just so frustrating when there's no information. It's clearly Samuel's summoned and just appears. There's not much description in terms of what that looks like, or is it physical? Is it a vision or something like that? And Samuel not making any comments to what he was doing. I mean, was he down there watching Netflix or what? But I mean, either way, he was irritated being dragged up. So I don't know, but that feels profound that is the first reference to once people are dead, in the sense that we understand people, there is something going on. But odd also that no one seemed to find that kind of weird in the story. It's let's go and get this medium and call people and chat to them. And Saul had banished all the mediums from the kingdom. You kind of think, why would you do that? It's just like making a telephone call to lost relatives, surely. So, I don't know, there's clearly something in the context of the culture and the time that I'm missing there, as usual. It occurred recently that it's definitely interesting that David is historically agreed to be a figure, which gives the Bible some credence as a historical document. But I believe in turn it seems that the Christians sometimes make the argument that, okay, there's David was real, therefore the Bible's real. And it's kind of a big leap between those 2 points. An example occurred that, say, 3,000 years' time, something's happened, there are no humans left on the Earth, but the Earth kind of looks roughly how it did. Aliens come down, they find a copy of James Bond on DVD, and they watch this thing and they see James Bond running around London, and they go out, check in London, and go, wow, this geography matches what's in the movie. Oh, this is interesting. This would contrast, however, with something like Robin Hood, Prince of Thieves, where Kevin lands at Dover and then by nightfall walks to his house in Nottingham from Dover via Scotland. For anyone not familiar with the geography, that's around about 700 miles. And I have checked, Concorde wasn't invented yet. So the geography doesn't work in the case of Robin Hood, Prince of Thieves. The aliens would watch that and go, this is a great movie, but no, I don't think this is real. They could look at James Bond and go, the geography's real, maybe this is real. And that would obviously lead them to a pretty false conclusion. So it is brilliant that we're getting some historical basis, but it's definitely another thing entirely to go from David was real to the story is real. Confirmation of a true historical figure does not a true story make, as it were, which is kind of annoying, but we'll have to soldier on. Anyway, that's about it for my thoughts on the Book of Samuel. So time actually, with a short video, to have a very quick recap on the books we've gone through so far, which I'm going to attempt to do off the top of my head, so this is going to be interesting. So we have Genesis, which was basically the idea that humans are deeply, well, as far as I could tell, it was about humans being deeply flawed, but necessarily so in terms of the point of being created. We have Exodus, which is basically, as far as I could tell, God is in charge, be excellent to each other. We have Leviticus, which was incredibly boring, but seemed roughly about how to manage a sinful nature. Numbers, which was basically the consequences of what would happen if we don't do as we're told. We have Deuteronomy, which was repetition of previous bits, but with some extra detail, so it was useful. We have Joshua, which was basically the Israelites coming into the Promised Land. Some difficult questions in terms of genocide, that sort of thing, but we'll move on. We have Judges, which I think, the idea I thought was that it seemed like God continually trying to help the Israelites and then continually turning away and sinning, despite the fact it was a very dark book. We have Ruth, which no flipping idea, but I suppose it does at least establish that you don't have to be an Israelite to be a goodie. We then have the Book of 1 Samuel, which is all that stuff I just said, broadly seems historical, I think. Hopefully that's right. I'm going to have to go back and check this afterwards, so if it's not, I'm going to have to fix it. If I've left it in there, I've got it all right in one go. But yeah, good fun story again, and great to be getting into some stuff that has historical corroboration for it, but again raises more questions than it answers, I think, so we'll have to soldier on. As ever, if anyone has any useful insights into stuff I've missed or other things I should be looking at, it would be great to hear them. Otherwise, we shall move on into the book of 2 Samuel, which presumably is going to see what David gets up to when Saul isn't throwing spears at him all the time.